Okay, so welcome everybody to UMG Layout Techniques from an ex-web developer's perspective. A little bit of background on me. I started out in QA at Sony back in like 2008. I worked on like MAG, Massive Action Game, and Fat Princess, and my main thing was MLB The Show on PS2. That was one of the later, one of the last ones to be on PS2, and then I got married, needed money, and was like, crap, I know how to do Photoshop and some HTML coding from high school. So, and I did an internship before then. So ended up pivoting and switching into the web industry. So I was doing apps and websites and the occasional like mobile game kind of thing. And, but mostly it was apps and tech as usual. And, I'd been trying to get back into games for a long time, so I'd been doing game jams, and I'd been doing just like, studying on the side, and so I just exposed myself to a bunch of engines and techniques and all that. And so when I made the pivot back, there was, I don't know, the fourth or fifth startup that failed later. I was like, enough is enough. So a little over a year ago, I transitioned back into games, and things that I learned from web ended up transferring pretty well. So I want to show you some of those things in this talk. So first things first, this is built in Figma, this presentation. So everything I'm going to show you, this is all like prototype. This is stuff you can do in Figma. And I would highly recommend that if you don't do it already, or, I know we have engineers here that may not be in, design tools and stuff as much as or at all compared to artists. But this transition of, handoff from art to engineering can really leave a lot of questions and a lot of gaps and a lot of assumptions that engineers and technical artists have to make in terms of implementation. So one suggestion I have is, if you are going to be building something in the art side, please, consider how you want stuff to move and feel and adjust based on content. Because if you have multiple screen sizes, which we'll talk about, in mind, if you have localization in mind, then it's going to be a whole lot easier for that communication in handoff to happen. So if I press this, boom, it changed. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to take this slide deck, and then we're going to make this in Unreal using UMG and make it so that it can do this whole, locked sides that are different sizes from the center, and stack the text if it's too long, and handle DPI. So we'll get through all of that. I have a pre-prepared sample that we can go through, and then I can do some of it live and see how far we get. I would like to be able to get to questions and see if you guys have things that you would like to try laying some things out, and be like, how do we do some weird clipping situations and glows and things like that. So that's what we'll get to. But first, let's do a little bit of a breakdown on the differences between how a web coder or designer would think versus someone who's using UMG. So first, a web developer has to be very concerned with the contents. And the rule is everything is driven by the content. And when I say the content, I mean text, images, whatever fills space is the thing that should determine how big it should be. And in the web's case, for those of you that understand UMG, everything is essentially a vertical box, unless you tell it not to be. And it used to be in the early days of the web, especially Web 2.0, when you were trying to do like, very skeuomorphic stuff, was I want to match this exactly, and there's the wording of being pixel perfect and stuff like that. And so people would use absolute positioning, which is to say, I want this exactly 20 pixels from the left, and it's going to be 500 pixels wide and 300 pixels tall, and any content inside of that, too bad if it's too big, or if the localization messes that up, right? So that gets really hairy really fast with absolute positioning, and you probably know what I'm talking about when it comes to you. So in a web designer's mind, relative to contents is like the biggest thing. Like things need to be flexible. The second thing is that you're never designing for one screen size. even if the assumption is, oh yeah, this everyone's got the same kind of screen, right? But no, we have mobile devices, we have tablets, we have varying screen sizes and browser sizes because of the way that browsers and screen sizes work, and how even the rendering engines work between them. And then accessibility options, people can crank up things like text size, like crazy, and change the fonts. End users have a lot more control than they typically do in video game projects. And so when I make a mock-up for a website, I don't expect it to be quote unquote pixel perfect. I expect the intention of the design to carry through and to adjust to the user's needs. So resolution independency is extremely important. So things like SVGs instead of using raster graphics is really important, because then you can be on a Retina display on mobile, and it both saves on performance, which we'll get to next, and on the actual pixel density, so you don't see blurry stuff. So we're also performance conscious. We got to be able to run on a potato, because often people are running on 30-year-old hardware. And these are not gamers. They don't have GPUs. They typically have a very, very modest CPU. And the bottleneck comes mostly from advanced GPU effects and then from their internet connection. So users are going to bounce off of your website if you don't load it within a second or two. And so you're trying to keep that in the milliseconds in terms of downloading assets. And so that's why we typically tend to see layouts that are a little bit more boring on the graphical side, because you're trying to go for speed and flexibility. That's the main thing that a designer is trying to do for web. So on the flip end, how does that compare to UMG? Now moving into games, how does that change how you approach it? Well, it's relative to content, right? We have canvas panels and this concept of a panel that is absolutely positioned, that has anchoring controls, which is different. We don't have that in the same way in web using CSS and HTML. But the concept is the same, where I could say I want this element to be exactly the typical 100 by 300 for a widget. And then the content would just kind of do its own thing. Or I can click size to content, and then I have it growing from wherever its anchors are. But most of the time when I see tutorials online, that's kind of ignored. And it's always this quick fix of drop a canvas panel, wrap things in 4 canvas panels, don't worry about the anchors, anchor everything to the top left. And it doesn't really respect the contents. And so I have a hard time when I watch those, because it's not respecting the content. It's trying to respect the layout that was given in a comp, but it's not trying to respect the actual content that is filling that layout. The second thing is, it's also resolution dependent, right? Independent. We can fall into a trap, and I've seen this also a lot, where modern displays, they're always 16 by 9, right? That's that. We got past 4 by 3. Now we're in 16 by 9. But now? No, we have ultra wide. We've got high DPI displays. We have 4K. We have 8K coming up. Maybe you need to be running on mobile. So we've got all this DPI stuff we have to worry about, which app developers also have to worry about. But most of that stuff is taken care of by the OS itself. They don't really have to hand tune it. We have to hand tune that. The default DPI scaling in Unreal is not super ideal. It works for what it is, but then I'll show you my DPI scaling. It's pretty much the same as what Ben suggests, is having it a stepped approach. And if you lay things out in a similar way to the methods that I'm going to show you, you're going to have a bit of an easier time. It's not going to solve everything. There's still going to be problems where you're going to have to do I use scale boxes here? How do I make something go portrait from this? Because we'll see it break. So there are limitations, but that's where you have to work through okay, at certain breakpoints now, I can adjust my content in Blueprints or in C++ or whatever it is. And then you can have a common core UI for all the platforms, because you already accounted for the fact that people are going to resize their screens. They're going to have it in windowed mode. They're not going to hit the exact resolution that you're hoping for. So, and then also when it comes to that resolution independency in UMG, because of the way that DPI works, with text being 96 DPI, whereas raster graphics are rendered at 72 DPI. It causes some issues in trying to translate designs anyway, right? Because you see the number is 18 for the font size, but it's actually 13 in UMG, because you have to multiply by 75% or whatever. So there's a bunch of things that come along with the resolution independency that's a little bit more hands-on in UMG than it is in something like the web. So also, you probably guessed, performance conscious, right? So games are worried about being limited, and mostly in our case, we're like, well, we don't want to be CPU bound because then we can't get information to all the other aspects of the game. And RAM has been like the thing that we always need more texture memory for all the beautiful like 3D graphics and stuff. So the UI is in this weird spot where it's like, well, the UI, if you're going to have a crazy UI that has all this fluff and graphics on it, you need textures, right? So how do you cut down on the textures? Because that's going to suck up your RAM because it has to be loaded in memory like the whole time at the highest resolution with no bitmaps. So we're limited in a way that 3D artists are not as much, or there's not as many tools available to us in terms of that, because it just needs to be there and ready on a whim at all times. So, but we're also worried about still being GPU bound. Someone could try to run this on a potato. Just ask Portal. And so anyway, the point being that we need to limit our texture usage. We're going to cut down on the excess layout wrappers because those do have a performance cost. And then we want to reuse assets, not just textures and materials, but also your layouts themselves. So how do we break down elements into like atoms and molecules and such to where like you have smaller bits that make up bigger bits? And I'll show just a little bit of that when we get into the demo. So you notice the pattern. So on the web in UMG, the web has HTML pages that are made up of multiple tags, and UMG is made up of user widgets. And this isn't an exact one-to-one, but you get the point that like the web has HTML tags that has like a section or an HR or something like that. And those little, an image tag, those are like the slate widgets that we have of an image widget and a text widget and whatnot. And then you have these modifier classes that don't mean the same thing as they do in Unreal, because it's not using C++. This is just using WebTech. But a class in this case is just a styling property. And that is essentially your details panel, reusable styles in common UI, stuff like that in UMG. And then you've got your functional stuff. So you've got JS, JavaScript, React, PHP, whatever it is, to try and make things functional, lead you down routes, and make things reactive and all that. And we have blueprints. Fortunately, the great thing about UMG is everything is one place. It is in one place. We have a visual designer. We have a layers panel like in Photoshop. We've got properties panels that we can adjust everything. We have a sequencer so we can animate right there. We have a blueprint editor so we can just quickly iterate. The sample I'm going to show you I made last night in a couple hours, and it's pretty wonderful that we have all that at our disposal. So what's the lesson here? Out of these 3 points, I would say pick a direction, let the content grow naturally. By that, I mean let the content decide how tall it needs to be. If this is going to be generally driven by its width, so that text will break at that width, and then let the rest of the container just grow, and then plan for scroll bars and such so that you can get through that content. So when you're thinking through grids or lists of items, try not to clip your text. Just let it flow naturally. Let it break to new lines. It gets kind of annoying in UMG, and I'll show you some issues with that, but you really can make things grow naturally without getting crazy on the absolute positioning stuff. Second is don't assume the screen size. So cast a wide net. Don't assume that everyone's going to be 16 by 9. Don't assume that everyone's going to be on the same DPI display. Try to make it so that what you're making can scale both in its actual scaling of the DPI and in the sizing of its elements and how they naturally will grow. And then the last thing is be efficient with your assets. Your engineers will thank you, especially your engine engineers, the ones that are trying to make things more performant. If you are reusing a bunch of stuff, it's going to keep with the way that programmers think in trying to reuse functions. You don't want to write the same function over and over and over again. You're just going to call that one function that does that little utility thing. So if that's what you're doing with a pattern in your design, then that's going to make it easier for the engineers to not have to make bespoke solutions for the same thing. So let's get into the demo. I have a project open here. And first I'll show what this looks like in game. So this is running an engine. This is with UMG. This is just dropping a HUD and has just a HUD container and then a safe zone, and then it's driven by the rest of the UMG stuff. If I take this and it looks just like the other one, you know, we're trying to match things as best we can. Now when I resize this, things are going to break properly. And then when I start getting the shorter side smaller, it's going to properly adjust. So this is what I'm talking about when I say you want things to be reactive and resolution independent. You want to make sure that the content is driving the, you know, the height of the text and how it wraps and all that jazz. And like, look at the bottom section where this text is moving up and it potentially could move to a third line. So I let it move to a third line. I'm not forcing it to be 2 lines or to cut off the text here. I'm not forcing this stuff to go outside of its bounds. You can do things like at lower resolutions, you know, change the padding of things. The DPI scaling should handle most of that, so you should get a relatively stable kind of look for everything. But you know, that was with these settings. I'll just, because I know I'm going to get asked. My DPI settings for this little demo is this. So at 900 height, I change it to 1.0. Before that, anything below that is going to be 0.75 scale. And then at 1440p, we start moving up to 1.5 scale. And then once you're at 4K, we go to 2 times scale, which follows with 1080p being doubled. So that's how I've laid this one out. That's not how it's going to be for every project. So you'll have to, you know, consult your engineers and figure that stuff out for yourself. But anyway, the one thing that I wanted to go over as we start this is a little bit about canvas panels. So this is what we typically see when we open a new widget, right? So I create a new widget. It's already got a canvas panel. Great. I'm like ready to go. I can start dropping a button in here and I can, you know, I can drag this and, you know, I can drag this around. I think I can count on 2 hands the amount of times I've actually used these drag handles, because everything is either driven by anchors. So I'm opening this constantly and I'm doing stuff like this. And this, size to content, anchor all around, you know, anchor only on the top so that it grows vertically. You know, if I'm going to use a canvas panel, I'm going to use the anchors to my advantage, and I'm holding Control and Shift when I click on these so that I can move the anchors and do the offsets. Because if you don't do that, it's going to move the anchors, but it doesn't change the offsets here. So position doesn't end up changing. So you want to be aware of that kind of stuff too. Is that there's little tricks that you can do in terms of shortcuts that just make your life easier. So when I'm working in canvas panels, this is what I'm doing. All right, so that's a canvas panel. When I was introduced to UMG and was told about something like an overlay or a border box, I got a lot more excited because that works a lot closer to the kinds of things that I want, where it's like a more of a content-driven thing by default. So if I change this to an overlay, it's already going to know I want to size this to content if it is aligned. The default alignment is left and top or both stretch. I think it's left to top is the default. If I fill this with text, now it's sized based on the text. And I can now, instead of having to set my anchors, I'm just saying, I want you to be in the middle. I want you to be in the middle here. I want you to be on the bottom. I want you to stretch. I want you to stretch this way. Like, it's a lot more straightforward when it comes to how I want to anchor things. And it works in the same way as a canvas panel in terms of like layering elements on top of it. If I wanted a second button that's here, I can just adjust the padding and say, I want this one to be above this one. Or below this one, make it a 56. But then you have problems where, like, you know, this text block could potentially break to a second line, right? Now, oh no, why did that just interact with this? Well, it's because the overlay doesn't care about, you know, the relation between the elements. All it cares about is the padding around your element and its relation to the parent container. So what you end up having to do in this situation is, okay, well, inside of that overlay, I might have a list of buttons or something like that. Or say we've got that horizontal thing on the bottom of our mockup, right? Where I need both of these to be wrapped in a horizontal box. So I can do that, and now it's respective of content. Now that's up there because we gave it 56 padding. So if I zero that out, now they're both being driven by their content. They're both respecting each other's layouts. They are also driven by the overlay container's layout. And if I spread this out and I tell these guys, I want you to fill your container, it's anchored to the left, so it's not going to do that. So I fill the container. Now they're equal to each other. There are things like spacers that you can use in here to start moving content away from each other. So like I'll see this a lot where people will put a spacer that has an X of, like 16 to space your content. The problem that happens here is when you're trying to dynamically add and remove elements, that spacer is still going to be there. So you have to account for adding and removing spacers as well, or you have to bake it into your widget. So what I like to do instead is to have some kind of a common padding. So like if I was going to make this button into a widget, I might give it, 8 left and 8 right padding, and then that will be reused on the other items. So you'll have 8 here and 8 here, and then that gives me my full 16 in the middle. Now there are some weirdness. There's some weirdness with this, and it's actually the same as in the web where there's a bug. I don't know if it's fixed yet, but there was a bug where if you didn't float, if you floated an element left, and floating is just saying, hey, I want you to move to the left and size to your content. Essentially what I just did here. This is left aligned horizontally is float left. It would double your left padding here. But if I notice what happens when I set this to center. In UMG, if you have it center aligned, in this case, well, let me take off the fill. These guys so you can see this a little bit better. So if I take off the fill on that guy and I say I want left or right padding, maybe it's fixed in this one. That might be the case. Anyway, in UE4, if this is centered on this, yeah, see how it moves over like that? The padding kind of messes up. So be aware that if you're not floating in the direction of the padding, well, in this case, horizontally floating either way, then you might get the wrong result when it comes to your padding output. So just be aware of that. That's kind of the basics of layout, like at a broad level. I mostly am using overlays, canvas panels sparingly, horizontal and vertical boxes. And even with horizontal and vertical boxes, I try to use those sparingly because they do have a resource cost in recalculating layout. But let's just get started. So this is our top overlay canvas. I'm going to prep this real quick. I'm dropping an image in here. This is something I do a lot too, is if something just needs a flat color, just don't put a texture on it. Just keep it none. And then use your color and opacity to drive the color. I usually am using the color and opacity and then tinting only for like special cases, like I have to additively animate stuff because I want things to return to its original color. So you can work with those in tandem. But and then I might grab a safe zone since this is a top level element. This is something I had to like really dig into, but like device safe, the safe zone is really device safe. So this is just trying to say like, hey, is there a notch on the phone, or is there overscan going on, or something like that? Like, and it's going to try and like push your contents inward. So that's essentially what this is doing. And then I want this to stretch all the way around. Because it's in an overlay, I didn't have to set any anchors. And then since it's a child of this overlay, I can add padding if I want. In this case, I want this to go to the edges because it is a safe zone, and I'm gonna put an overlay inside of it. And then that overlay is automatically going to stretch around. But now I can add padding to this. And in our case, we want the padding to be 32 all around. So I have my master ones set up here. So if we don't get through it, I'll just walk you through this of what I did. But this is all based on the Figma values. So I'm like going into Figma and I am grabbing this and I'm saying like, how far from the edge is this? I'm holding Alt. And so I'm just saying for that container, what's my spacing? I grab that and I put it in here. I think depending on DPI scaling and stuff, there might be some wonkiness. Like we're viewing this at DPI scale 1 because we're currently previewing this at 1920 by 1080. And because of our DPI scaling rules, that is 1. So it should be 1-to-1 with when I put 32, it means 32 pixels. In the web world, you would say DPs, so like the dips that are resolution independent pixels. And you're never working off of actual pixels. It's like a scaled pixel. So if it's a high density screen, 1 pixel might be actually 2 or 4 pixels, depending on the density and size of the screen. So in this case, we got 32 all around. We can reliably guess that that's going to be 32 pixels exactly. And then we're going to end up putting something inside of this. So in this case, I have, I can compile this, and now you see that the padding, that's the 32 padding right there. So if you want to see your design without the crawling ants, this was something that a lot of people didn't know that you could disable. You can just preview what it's going to look like without the crawling ants. So we're going to slot something in here, but what I'm going to do with that is make a content panel that we can then put in there. So I'm going to get my content panel and drop that in. Right now there's nothing in it. I do want it to stretch all around, but now I've stubbed it out. So for this demo, I'm going to be working primarily in here. So I've got, when I start new stuff, I just prefer to have it empty. I might in the future make it so that it's just overlays in there, but I don't always need an overlay, and sometimes replacing with child can be wonky. So it's best to just start with an assumption of you don't know what this widget is going to be. So I'll pull in an overlay in here because I know that this content panel, what I'm talking about is this thing right here. So I've separated out my elements into like kind of major pieces. So I'm talking specifically about this area of the content that's like that inner content area. So in here, I've got an overlay that's going to stretch, and then I have an image that I'm just going to drop in here, and this is going to be the background. But we're going to make this stuff special. So this is going to stretch, and then I'm going to go and grab, I have a few textures prepared, but there's just 4 textures. My logo, there's a cut corner, because I'm going to show you how to do that cut corner thing in the bottom, and like switch between 2 types. And then I've got like a null color, but I also made an SCF bordered box that has normalized output. So I can go into here and I can say I want this to exactly have 4 pixels of border thickness, and it will give me 4 pixels. So I want the material instance. I'm going to drop that on my image. And then I don't want it to stretch, draw as an image, because that's going to stretch the whole thing. I want this to draw as a box, and I'm going to put the margins in the center. So 0.5 is going to go 50% and 50% from all sides to make it so that it respects. It's going to cut this tiny 32 by 32 in half, and then just stretch anything in the middle, which is, there's nothing in the middle, so to be solid. If you have a tiling texture, you got to enable tiling and all that. But we're not going to get into that. So the next thing we want is a named slot. So here I want to be able to put content into this panel. So I'm going to drop a name slot in here. I'm going to have it sized to the whole size of the container. And then I'm going to add some padding to it. But this is normally going to be driven, for me anyway, by blueprints. So I can show you in my finished example. I have this set up so that there's just a utility function, so I can preview it in the browser, or preview it in the designer, and then on construct it's actually going to apply those settings. And all I'm doing is feeding in to the overlay slot of that padding. Now, I didn't talk about slots, but this is an important concept. Something that's weird about UMG, it's not weird, it's just weird from my perspective, because I'm like, if I have a div, of course the div is already a vertical box, so it has a vertical box slot, right? So in this case, if there's nothing on the top level, so this overlay does not have, like you saw, the padding controls, that's because it hasn't been given a parent yet, which is why we have that top level canvas. So I slot this in here so that this can have padding and whatnot on this level, but when I go into the content panel here, that top level doesn't actually have any controls for that, because this parent is going to be the one that controls. So I just know that at this root level, I want an overlay so I can stretch things and I can put content into it. The named slot will make it so that when I drop my content in here, I will have a slot exposed that I can put other stuff in it. So now if I compile this and I say, okay, I've got my contents here, come back to my top canvas. Oh, there it is, contents, and it's all laid out here. It's got the padding applied. And now what I can do is say I wanted to add some text into here. I could, so let me open this guy up. Now this is an example of the slot in action, right? If I just drop this in here, because it doesn't have any, like, the name slot doesn't have any slot controls. It's just taking that from here. So it says, oh, I'm in an overlay. I have an overlay slot. You edit that here. I can't override the name slot in here. So what you have to do is, if you want this to just fill to whatever it is, that's what the slot will do. Otherwise, I might have to add an overlay inside of it to say, okay, I want to be able to wrap contents within that. So I'm going to put this inside of an overlay and drop this in there instead. So now I have independent control of where that element inside of it is going to go. So we're coming up on a half an hour now, and I think I want to just walk you through how I did the rest of it and not do it entirely live. Because I want to get to some of your guys' questions too. So we'll leave the live portion there, and then I'll walk you through here on the pre-made stuff. But that's kind of the basic gist of things. Let me start pulling these in. So here's the final layout. We've got one content panel. There, you could have multiple content panels. It doesn't really matter. This is the kind of thing that would be handled by the new HUD classes, and there are different ways to do this now. But this is just a basic high-level way of doing it, where I've got this one content panel, and then that panel has a few things inside of it, and that could be variable. So you can see I have a whole bunch of user widgets here because I'm reusing these. So in the footer, I know that this stylistically is the same. Like, I know that all of them are going to have like text and a border and spacing and whatnot. And a background, and that background could be a cut corner or it could be a straight corner, and it might have right content and it might not have right content. So this one is just straight text. So what I did in here was I was like, okay, I know I want these options in here, so I planned for it, right? So I have a size box that is going to give it a minimum desired height, because in my Figma mockup, nothing is, in this case, the logo is driving the height of this container. But I can't guarantee that I'm going to have a logo that's that high, right? So I know that visually, this is kind of the baseline that I want. And it would be great if this can affect the height, but I can't guarantee it. So to keep the designer's intent, which in this case, that was my intent, I'm going to plan for the fact that this needs to be at least 68 tall, and then can get bigger if it needs to. And then inside of that, I'm going to drop an overlay because the size box only gets one child. And then I'm going to start adding stuff to that overlay. So in this case, I'm going to put a bottom line, a background image. That background image might change. So now I can toggle if it has a cut corner or not. And all that's doing in the blueprint is saying, hey, do you want the cut corner? If you do, then change the visibility on that top right image and change the background brush. In this case, I couldn't quite figure out how to get a null color, so I just put like a 2x2 texture in there that is just solid white. I'd prefer to just have it be none. Didn't figure out how to clear that out. So if anyone knows, please let me know. When it comes to the box itself that has the text in it, I know that might have content next to it, so a slot on the right. So I'm gonna put a named slot in here, but by default, I'm going to collapse it. So if the name slot exists because of my little variables here, my settings, then I want it to show. But otherwise, I want it to get out of there. I don't want it, to push my content around or be like a phantom thing in the UI. And I also want this one to be the one that is driving the spacing between stuff, because this text, the content left text, the one that I know is always going to be there, I want that one to drive the width of the container, and I don't want like the padding on the sides to be affected by it. I just want the new content that's going to get introduced to push the other text a little bit. So that's the one that gets its own padding left to give space between the elements, like in here. So this spacing between here is what I'm talking about. This right content will drive that 48 pixels in between those elements. And if there is no right content, then this is just going to be 16 on either side. And then, so in practice, what that looks like is I've set up this base widget, which is this one on the left. And I have some options here, so I can override text and preview it, and I can add the cut corner if I want. And I can also say I don't want to wrap the text, or I do. So it kind of gives me more flexibility here. So now I could just duplicate that and say, okay, I have a center one. That one does have the cut corner. That one has a longer string. That one has right content. And I can drop stuff into that named slot. In this case, I don't need an overlay because it's just going to be text that goes in there. Same thing with the image. I just need to drop something in there. Don't care about the slot, but it will push things as I need it. So And now, because of the way that I set this up, this is all in a horizontal box, and the two on the sides are set to auto size to the right, and they want to fill, because I know that the center one is the one that's getting the most text. So these guys are not going to wrap their text. If this gets longer, so if this is like the amazing UI designer, that's going to push the rest of the text over, right? But it's not going to break. So this is going to stay as wide as it needs to be. This one, on the other hand, will break because we have that checked. All that's doing is overriding on the actual text layer the property in the properties panel of wrap text, auto wrap text. So this just gets toggled. If I was to toggle this in my settings, should wrap text, that's just targeting this guy to say, yes, you should wrap your text. So by default, I'm going to turn that off. Sorry, I'm going really fast. I'm trying to get through a lot. I will stop this in about 5 minutes, and then we can get to questions and whatnot. So yeah, so then these two are like, I just need to be on the sides, drive by my content, don't wrap it. This guy needs to fill the entire slot, so I set it to size to fill. If I want that to be smaller, I can say that one of these is like, say, I know I have 3 items, so it might be, I want to fill the entire thing. So I'm going to do this divided by 3. So if I have 3 items, it's kind of arbitrary. I could just say 3. And then left, I could say fill to, yeah, say 1. I want that to be one part of that. So this one is set to fill on both sides and to fill based on, to stretch based on the content. This one is set to anchor to the right, so it's only sizing to its content, and then it's telling it to fill to that factor. So I can get spacing between this stuff. That's the same thing as in Figma of me saying space between elements, which I think I'm doing in one of these. Anyway, space between is the same property in auto layout in Figma. So I can set that to fill. I can set that to auto. I can set it to go to the sides. Yada yada yada. You get the gist. I'm going to reset these back to auto and this to fill. Doesn't really matter, but to 1. And then in this guy, I have this guy in an overlay. It's being driven by the width, so it's horizontally aligned to fill, and it's anchored to the bottom. So as this sizes, it's gonna move. So now this is another place where, because we set up the DPI scaling rules, you can now see how that's going to react in real time as you're adjusting your layouts. So this gets really, really helpful when I know that 1920 is my baseline, and I can, start checking my work and be like, okay, does that spacing generally look the same as it did at 1x, right? If I go to 4x, I want that kind of gap over here. You kind of have to eyeball it unless you get explicit, values from your designers. But I wouldn't rely on that. Everything has to be kind of driven by the content here and the resolution. So you're not going to have 1-to-1 exactly, but it'll be close enough that you can reasonably guarantee that you have enough space for things to behave consistently across the screen sizes. So yeah, I think I'm gonna call it there. There was one other little thing. This is a vertical box. It's very simple. There was one thing I wanted to show with text, which was that you can mess with margins, but it's hidden down here. So you have to be careful with this, especially with localization. So there's probably stuff you'd want to work with your engineer on, but after justification, you can open this advanced spot, and this is the outer bounds of your text layer. So this is not the same as line height, but line height is here. So I wanted these to be tighter. If this is at 1, things get spaced out according to the settings in the font. But I know that I want this to kind of be tight on the top, so I'm going to -16 that. And bottom also. So you can add or remove space on the top and bottom of the bounds of your text box. And you can also change your line height, which is the spacing between the letters. It's not between the lines, but it's actually doing that on the top and the bottom of it. So just be aware that when I change that value, it's actually changing the top, the upper part and the bottom part, and it's kind of squeezing those together in the center of the text line. But yeah, so just be aware that I use margin to kind of control this kind of behavior if I need to make sure that I'm lining things up, especially if people in Figma had adjusted their text. So in here I had you can't really do that negative stuff, so I use an auto layout wrapper. um, that will add some like bottom padding and stuff, and I'll just force it to be a lower line height. So anyway, I'm just fiddling with the numbers here and like margins and line height to get the same result, and still let it break naturally and not kind of break the look of this, because you could very easily make this funky. The other thing here is that for previewing this, if I take this out of custom and I say like desired, it will quickly start like freaking out. Like if I adjust this in any way, the text itself will start like flickering and stuff. It gets real funky. If you want to avoid that while you're previewing this, because I want this to be driven by content, people get freaked out by the fact that it'll flicker. Just set it to custom and then set it to like a comfortable width that shows you that your breaking is working. So that's my recommendation there. That's pretty much it for the basics of this stuff. If there are questions, I think we can get into it now because it is done. That's pretty much everything I wanted to cover for this particular talk. There's more I didn't get to, like in terms of I didn't add these flourishes. I kind of wanted to make those live, but we can talk through it. I would probably make like one or two. I'd probably make one reusable element that has like a width variable that you could set, and maybe you could have like an array of how many lines you want and how wide you want them to be in terms of percentage. So I want one to be a full one to be half, one to be tiny, or whatever, and then you can drive the width with either a size box around all of the elements, or you could drive it per element. Kind of depends on how complicated your sub widgets are for that. So if this is more sci-fi that like Jared would show, I would have a different approach to how I would size those. So Kate asked, what are your thoughts on having the UI designed at 1080p versus 4K? And my demo was at 1920 by 1080. So the thing is that when I'm designing in Figma or Photoshop, typically designers don't want to design at 4K on their canvas size, which is a little different from their actual size, right? So canvas size wise, it's just easier to be like, I know that if I render this composition at 1x, right, and that 1x is 1920 by 1080, then on most of our screens that we're designing on, we've got 1080 displays. Or if you don't, it's 1080 is probably like looks like this, on like a 4K display. So I want things to look one-to-one, and I personally use a baseline of 1080p because then I can do like, okay, twice that is 4K. I can't remember if it was like 75% or half of that. I'm not good at math on the spot. So anyway, I can go up and down from this baseline, but I'm rendering out potentially vector elements. These I could render out at 2x, right? If I wanted to make sure that these are like 4K ready, I could just plan for the fact that my assets need to be bigger, and then I can either use bitmaps or SDFs or any other of those kind of optimization approaches to make sure that I've got assets that will look right. Text will scale properly. Your containers will scale properly. Your materials are a little trickier. So it kind of depends on your workflow. I personally prefer to design in 1080p, be aware that things are going to get smaller, and then prepare DPI so that when I go to like 720p or something like that, that it's still readable. So I might have to do an early test for our style guide to make sure that that will follow well with my DPI scaling rules. I don't know if that helps, but I will distribute the project files and this Figma prototype and stuff. Old Siren asked, I tend to ask this to hear other people's experience with it. Have you had experience designing menus for a game that is both on mobile and console PC resolutions? And if so, any things to look out for when converting between mobile and console PC menus? Yes, most of that has to do with like, so we call that breakpoints in web design, and our DPI scaling rules are pretty much that. But you probably have to use things like wrap boxes, because like this 3-column wide thing on a mobile device might be stacked vertically instead of horizontally, because on mobile you want to grow vertically more, and it depends on whether or not you have a 16 by 9 like guaranteed this is only a widescreen landscape display for my game, or if you can turn it to portrait, that overcomplicates everything. And then you need to make new tech to be like, I need to swap a horizontal box out for a vertical box and then account for all the padding rules. So it's tricky, but it can be done. And it's not impossible because you have access to all that layout information and blueprints anyway. So as long as you're setting up with the idea early on that, yeah, this is going to be on mobile and I have portrait, then you can adjust it dynamically in Blueprint. And then it's going to be up to the designers, the artists, to mock it up in that way too. Like I would provide 2 versions of this cover slide, you know, one at a mobile resolution and one not. And you see how that breaks down, right? So like I'm going to have to go in here and make a mobile specific version in here. But by describing this to my engineers visually in my mockups, if I have these 2, they only have to build one system and just be aware of how it adjusts rather than having to make 2 entirely different widgets for that same thing. Hope that makes sense. And then Wickerman said, when designing UI assets, does it matter if they're power of 2? I typically always make sure they are power of 2, but because Unreal has techniques to like, you know, bundle things together into assets at build time or, you know, use atlases in general, I would just say that I generally do keep things power of 2. So this is like 56 by 56. This is 24 by 24. This one is 84 by 40, but I wanted it to be closer to power 2. So, you know, I padded it a little bit. I also don't like the fact that the way that textures render, you can't really do edge to edge when you've got like half pixels like this, because it'll just add a little, like this will render as like a solid pixel at times, depending on your compression settings. That can get really, really messy. So yes, I try to keep it power of 2 as close as possible. And then if you're gonna like bundle things in atlases, the atlases definitely need to be power of 2. I never put anything in unless it's a multiple of 4. For Cade, again, another quick question. Do you normally use border or image elements for displaying images in UMG? I tend to almost exclusively use image elements, so I'm not sure if I know the exact use case of borders. I'm the same way. I use overlay with image. I kind of despise border because I don't get it. I don't get the point of it. I know that I understand the point of it is to make it so that I don't have to have a separate image element. I don't get why that can't just be an overlay that has multiple children and has a background element. I tend to find that I need an overlay more because I don't just need my background to be in like just all around. And I also don't need it to cut out things automatically. That was causing issues with my material because I would set it to border or to box, and it was like cutting things out. And it wasn't giving me 4 pixels, it was giving me like 1 pixel. But if I used an image and set it to box, it's because border is doing stuff in the background to try and, you know, hey, I'm a border, I'm gonna cut things out. But yeah, I tend to use overlays almost exclusively when I'm doing like backgrounds, and then I'll use a separate image layer. When it comes to images, though, I would say that you don't want to layer too much. Like if you're finding that you have like a pulse, a glow, or whatnot, which is something I know Ben wanted me to touch on, was like how to handle glows, which is actually something we could go back into Engine 4. Shoot, hold on, my headphones turned off, even though I didn't ask it to. All right, so if you're finding that you're using like 3 or more images stacked on top of each other to get like a glow effect, I would highly recommend against doing that. The easy way to do that is to just combine them in a material. It depends on what your needs are for your game and whether or not you can do that. I would personally recommend putting that in material, because what you can do here is you would have a single layer here, and then you could, you know, have it so that it has negative padding. I use negative padding a whole lot when I got to do stuff like that. So if I want, if I know that glow could go up to like 16 pixels, and you'll have to tinker around and find what these numbers are, but I can put negative margins. Now the overlay thinks that it's this size, but the background thinks that it's 32 pixels bigger on all sides. And that's how I would handle something like a glow that's supposed to go out of its container. And then I would handle the glow itself and like the bounds of the image in the material, and just make sure that my math can account for that. My biggest frustration with the material approach, though, is that I can't generate them. Like, I can control it here. So if I say that this should be based on 64 by 64, I can do that and recompile, and then the border is a different size, because now it's running the math with the 64 by 64 brush reference. But the material itself, like previewing that, planning for it is a lot trickier. Like this material is based on the fact that it's going to be a 32 by 32 brush, and you can't always account for that. So in my material, I'm just saying, hey, make this human readable, because you're working with percentages here for your parameter. I want to put a whole number in here and say 4 means 4 pixels. So I'm going to remap the value range based on a 32 by 32 box, and then get that output in an SDF, smooth step it, and that gives me an exact output. Let's see, another question for how do you handle animating dynamically sized containers? So this is another thing. Same thing with this. Usually I'm not animating their transform properties, right? I'm animating their slot properties. So instead of doing background like transform, I rarely use the render transform. I only use that for rotating things and for brief scale up and down. I never use that to really drive offsets. So I would do something like padding, right? Because you can grab the slot and say, I want to animate this from, 16, and I want that to go out to, negative 48. And now I've got that growing, and it's still not affecting the layout, because this is 5. Yeah, this is 5 version 2, Robin. None of this stuff, I don't have common UI plugin enabled in here or anything. This is all bare bones stuff. There are issues with things like overlay in past versions of Unreal where it causes issues with like global invalidation. I found that out recently, and it was messing up my world because I had to revert to canvas panels. But yeah, so I mean, to answer the question, I would use just this relative container stuff, right? If I know that it's in an overlay or a horizontal box, then I know I have stuff like padding accessible, and that makes my life way easier. And then I have exact pixels to work off of for that stuff. So yeah, I would say animate the slot, and don't rely too much on transform. If that has negative performance concerns, just be aware that if you're animating scale, like that's not going to give you exact pixel results. That's going to be based on the container size. So if you have a vertical container that grows and you're scaling by 1.2, that might be 32 pixels at one point and then 64 pixels when it's twice as big. So just keep that in mind. Another question, how do you handle, do you animate the fill factors of containers for collapsing and opening sections? What I would do is bind to the start and end of those, so that I toggle the visibility before and after the animation is completed, and then I can control the visibility then. So if I'm having like an outro animation, I would bind in blueprints the animation finished, and then I would toggle the visibility. And then you get smooth closing, and then it's gone. And that makes it a little bit easier. I think that's what you were asking. Or converting between mobile and PC console in regards to performance for UI textures for mobile, where on console you may be using a larger resolution image. That one is tricky because I haven't released any games. Like I did make this transition recently. So in the web, I would tell you how to do that, and that is that you have different images for different platforms, or you would have SVG images. So for me, I would try to use SDFs as much as I can, or SDF prepared textures, and then I don't have to swap them at all. I can have a 64 by 64 or 128 texture that works just fine on mobile and on a 4K monitor, but it's not always possible. So in the cases where it's not possible, you kind of have to, you might use a data table to switch them, or you might have a select in your blueprint. Like let me grab one of these guys. So like in here, one of these guys. So if you just do select, and you're going to pump that into a texture output. Actually, I have one down here. So like this texture output right here, you could do like an enum and say what your platform is, and then fill it with a different texture that is specific to that platform. That is one way that you could do it. That is very tedious. I would probably do that on a higher level, like in a data table or something like that, to have like a library of mapped values, and then you would just feed that into this brush. I would prefer to do it that way. But this is another way if you're just doing it hot and dirty like I did. But yeah, you will have to worry about building those too. So you might have to like not include stuff in the build for like mobile, and then it would select the right one for that. But I'm not experienced enough to know that aspect of it. I'm not tech experienced enough on that end. So you'd have to talk to engineers about it. We are coming up on time. So one thing that I wanted to touch on was there was an image that Ben shared, which was this. So he was asking about like this little arrow over here, and then glows. We talked about glows, so I would do negative padding on that, prepare it in your material, try to combine them. Or if you're going to stack them, have the inner material be the solid one, and then have the one behind it be negative padding outside of it. That'll give you an easy glow. For these, it's the same technique. You just have to be careful with your clipping. So on something like this, let me pull up actually Leonardo, because that worked out really well. So I wonder if I can paste this in here. Yeah, here we go. So in this case, what I would do is I would take this scroll box, right? And this would be the area that it clips. Oops. This would be the area that it clips, and it doesn't clip the side here. And then this is negatively positioned outside of this container. What you can also do is use a size box and a canvas panel to force the size of the canvas panel to be 0, and then let this content size to its own content. So then you have like it's kind of the same thing we do in Figma to like fake negative margins, is you'll put an empty container that is 0 pixels and then put something inside of it that is bigger and then offset it in a negative direction. You just have to make sure that it's not being clipped by the container that you're putting it in, especially with something like this where there's also a scroll bar that you have to work. So I hope that answers that question. I don't have enough time to do that live right here, but that would be my answer for that like negative margin problem. Let's see, are there any more questions? Do you then need your own custom shadows on the scroll box to do that? New Zealand, could you kind of explain a little bit more what you mean by that? Do you mean for like the bottom and top of the scroll box? Just waiting for a reply. He's typing. As the contents of the box are faked, the shadow would go off the left of the main UI section. You mean on the scroll box itself? Well, it wouldn't, because I see what you mean. You would just add the same left margin. Oh, I see. You're talking about the top and bottom shadows on that. The scroll box is always flipped. Yeah. That's a little trickier, yeah.
I can explain how it actually works inside the scroll box, if that helps.
Yeah, sure.
So the way they actually do it in the scroll box is whenever they scroll, they literally check to see if there's any elements outside the screen, and if so, it would then apply a rendering. I think it was like an image. It would literally show it and cause the black shadow to show up, and it did it for the
yeah, so if that's the case,
beginning and end.
Yeah, if that's the case, then I would say that you could feed in the same negative margin, like the same amount that you're extending it out to the side, right? Let me pull this back up. If you're extending out the clipping box to be out there, right? You would want that shadow that's being generated by the scroll box to also be offset on that left. So it would essentially, it's fake because the clip is happening out here and the image is starting here, but you're pushing that image in the same way that you're pushing this one out. So, and it'll depend on, like, I would have to work with an engineer on that to make that work, because if that requires like code changes and stuff, we might have to go into Slate and like make a custom scroll box that handles that kind of offset here. Yeah, I think we're at time. If there's anything else, hit me up on the Discord. I'm pretty active. I love talking about this stuff. I'm like obsessed with UMG and all this junk. So I'd love to talk more about SDFs and performance and tech UI stuff. And I'm getting into C++. So yeah, if you guys have anything to share, I know that I and others would appreciate. So thanks for all of your talks. And hopefully that was helpful. So that's all I've got for today.
That was great, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank
Yep.
you.